All right, everyone. It looks like we are streaming and we are live on YouTube and Facebook. Let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Jake Varghese. Thank you for joining us for our first ever Justice Town Hall series. The Justice Town Hall series is something we created to examine justice from every angle. What do we mean by that is pretty simple. We're going to look at justice from every angle. So we're going to look at criminal justice, environmental justice, housing justice, education justice, etc. And we're going to keep going through those until we solve problems. Inside of each of these series, we're actually going to have tracks of different topics. So inside of the criminal justice series today is the history part of the track. Why do we need to go over history? Well, from an engineering standpoint, I can tell you that it's very, very difficult to solve problems when you don't know how you got the problem. And so it's very important that we uncover some of the, let's say, revisionism that's going into the criminal justice history that we have. And we need to unpack that and take a look at what really happened so that we can actually solve the problems correctly. Our Evolution East Bay is a local chapter of Our Evolution, which was founded in the wake of the Bernie Sanders 2016 campaign. And we draw our leadership from Nina Turner, Jim Hightower, Larry Cohen, Ben Jealous, James Ogby, and many other notable progressives. Our job is to elect progressives at every level of government and enhance the community around us. Last cycle, we won 25 out of 34 endorsed races locally in 2020 and won over 70% of our endorsed races nationally in 2020. We are the only truly national grassroots progressive organization fighting at every level of government. Please join us at ourevolutioneastbay.org. And now I'm going to pass it over to our co-sponsors, the Coalition for Police Accountability, and my co-host, Kathy Leonard. Kathy, are you ready? Oh, looks like you're muted.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kathy Leonard. I'm on the steering committee of the Coalition for Police Accountability. I'm sure you've all heard of our organization and also Measure LL. So LL was created in 2016 by 83% of the voters. And basically what Measure LL did was seek the police commission and the community police review agency. The police commission is tasked to oversee and create policy by the Oakland Police Department, and they can terminate the police chief with cause. The community police review agency investigates complaints against police officers that are filed by civilians and recommends discipline. They also audit the Oakland Police Department's compliance with reforms which were mandated by the federal monitor back so many years, 18 years ago. Number two will be kind of encapsulated in number three, which is Measure S1. So 81% of Oakland voters passed Measure S1, which was to strengthen the oversight powers of the Oakland Police Commission. One of the issues that faced the police commission was independence. They didn't have their own attorney, so they had to rely upon counsel and advice from the city attorney's office, who also represents the Oakland Police Department. So you can see that there is a conflict of interest in representing both of these parties. The other thing about Measure S1 was it's seating an inspector general. And that person will be tasked with investigating and reviewing the city's handling of police misconduct. So that's what, Measure S1 actually seated these two positions, which will be staffed under the police commission. They report to the police commission, and therefore they have much more authority than they ever had under Measure S1, or more authority, I should say. So that's the skinny on what the work that we've been doing since, before 2016. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kathy. So let's talk about today. So let's talk about today's agenda. Today is the Criminal Justice Series, which is the history track. And today's speakers will be Dr. Bilal Ware, Pamela Price, Esquire, Dr. Jody Armour, and Chesa Boudin, Esquire. Since we created this town hall to not just educate the public, but we also wanted to educate public officials because they are the ones that are already empowered to take this knowledge and apply it immediately. So in that vein, we have a Q&A panelist made up of former and current elected officials. We have Gus Newport, former Berkeley mayor, Kate Harrison, Berkeley City Council member, Gail McLaughlin, Richmond City Council member, Melvin Willis, Richmond City Council member, Javanka Beckles, AC Transit Council, and Barisha Spriggs, Alameda Dem Central Committee. And so with that, let's go ahead and let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Bilal Ware, who is a professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and specializes in pre-modern West African history. His research interests include Islam, popular religious culture, and race. He is the author of several books, which we have a list of on our description page for the town hall and under each video on YouTube and Facebook. And after the Q&A panelists for their questions, we're going to take questions from the audience members at Facebook and YouTube. So if you're watching the live stream, please add your questions and comments to those platforms, and we'll pick them up and ask them during that time. Dr. Ware, are you ready and unmuted?
I am ready and unmuted.
Great. Let me go ahead and stop sharing, and you can go ahead and start. All right.
All right. I'm just going to say a few words before I share my screen. It's an honor, a privilege, and a pleasure to be in such an auspicious gathering as this one, where the struggle is for justice. In the academic world, sometimes it tends to get lost. So I feel fortunate to be able to be part of this discussion today. So as Jake mentioned, I'm a historian of West Africa, also teach African American history. And I actually specialize in the history of abolitionist struggles in West Africa and in African American communities. So I wanted to provide some deep historical context to the contemporary freedom struggles that are facing our community and allow us to situate ourselves in a deeper lineage of struggle to face up, frankly, to the challenges of white supremacist systems that seek to commoditize Black life, that seek to put carceral restraints on humanity of color, especially. So I'm going to take you guys first back into the history of slavery before we move into closer to the present. This is from a text from 1845 written by a very forward-thinking Christian evangelist. The book was entitled Pro-Slavery Interpretations of the Bible That Are Productive of Infidelity. This is from a forward-thinking white evangelical who supposed that beating enslaved Africans over the head with the Bible and telling them that they could serve masters in heaven as they had served them on earth was probably not going to be a very effective means of trying to spread morality and righteousness amongst the enslaved community. So he gathered a series of stories that suited those rhetorical purposes. And this appeared in one of those passages. It is the story of an enslaved African man who had actually struggled against the institution of slavery before being sold as a slave. And I'll just read it because it'll get us into today's topic. In the year 1806, on the arrival of a slaver from the coast of Africa, John Doherty went to the city of Savannah to buy slaves. After several hundred had been sold in lots and single as suited the purchasers, a middle-aged man was put upon the stand who wished to make a communication before he was sold, the purport of which was that he was a Mohammedan and that whenever the hour of prayer and other devotional duties came, he must have time to attend to them. Mr. Doherty, who had lately embraced religion and seemed to be zealous to promote the cause, gave the highest price for him, feeling confident within himself he would soon convert him to the true faith. Taking him to his plantation, he built him a hut and assured him that he should be allowed the time he required and in addition should have every opportunity to attend all the meetings of the Christians. The Mohammedan slave for a while attended these meetings and learned something of Christianity without, however, discontinuing his former devotions. At the expiration of about a year, his master, who was intent on his conversion, asked him formally if he did not prefer Christianity to Mohammedanism and if he would not openly renounce the prophet and acknowledge Jesus Christ. The slave asked if the Christian religion allowed one Christian to hold another in slavery and their children after them. The answer, of course, was in the affirmative. The Mohammedan replied that the religion of the prophet did not allow that. The result of all was this slave, in a land of Bibles and gospel ministers, daily said his prayers, performed ablutions, made his prostrations, and at an advanced age died, declaring that God was one God and Muhammad was his prophet. This story related to an evangelical in the early part of the 19th century captures, sorry for the play on words, the fact that already as enslaved Africans were disembarking from boats that were bringing them into carceral bondage in the United States of America, they were armed with moral, rhetorical, political, and historical tools to critique and attempt to dismantle the systems that held them in bondage. And the first lesson that I drew from this when I began speaking, especially in the African American community and the Muslim community this past summer after the Floyd uprisings, was that the first resource that we have is to actually mine our histories. To not assume that we are facing these problems anew. And the second lesson was that if we don't situate ourselves in the abolitionist genealogies of our forefathers, then how will history write about us? I asked the question of our community and of our community leadership, will the histories that are written of this era 100 years from now question us the way that we question those who were complicit with slavery? Will they ask, where were you when millions of people were being held in bondage, when the United States of America was becoming the single largest carceral state to ever exist in human history? What efforts did we make to stand up to resist that? And that's the next part of the presentation that I want to take us to, is a history of a struggle against that actually produced that man on that Savannah dock, and indeed produced, as it happens, the ancestors of a number of people, prominent abolitionists, as it happens, in the African American community. So this is a quotation that comes from my first book, which is a history of struggles against colonialism and imperialism in West Africa. And this is an excerpt from a book called Letters on the Slave Trade that's written by the Reverend Thomas Clarkson. The Reverend Thomas Clarkson, as it happens, is the founder of the London Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, the first modern abolitionist institution founded anywhere in the Western world. He is actually the tutor in all things anti-slavery of William Wilberforce, who ends up becoming a much more widely known name, a name that might have passed some of your eyes when you were reading histories of struggles against the institution of slavery. In Clarkson's first work on the topic of struggle against the slavery and in making his advocacy to European governments, he actually cites African Muslim scholars, intellectuals, and activists who had already abolished the institution of slavery in West Africa in the year, as it happens, of 1776, the same year of the American Revolution. So I'm just going to read a passage now from Clarkson's first work on abolition, as he attributes to al-Mami, which is a Fulani pronunciation of the term imam, al-imam. So it's just a leader. To the sovereigns of Europe, the wise and virtuous imam sets an illustrious example in extirpating the commerce in the human race. And when we consider this amiable man as having been trained up in a land of slavery and as having had in the introduction of such a revolution all the prejudices of education and custom to oppose, when we consider him again as sacrificing a part of his own revenue, as refusing the presence of Europeans, and as exposing himself in consequence of it to the vindictive ravages of the agents of the latter, he is certainly more to be respected than any of the sovereigns of Europe, inasmuch as he has made a much nobler sacrifice than they and has done more for the causes of humanity, justice, liberty, and religion. Anglican priest, writing in 1790 to praise an African Muslim for doing more for the causes of humanity, justice, liberty, and religion than any of the rulers of Europe. Not satisfied with these proceedings, the Imam made a decree as a discouragement to the slave trade in the beginning of the year 1787, that whereas slaves made in other distant countries had been accustomed to be passed in their way to Fort St. Louis, this is Saint Louis, for those of you that might have been to Senegal, On their way to Fort St. Louis through his dominions, no such passage should be allowed them in the future, and accordingly, at the proper season of the year, he put his decree into execution by stopping the passage of slaves. They tried him next by many and rich presents, but he sent them all back, adding that he would not only hinder the route of the slaves for that year, but as long as he should live, and that if the whites should attempt any depredations on his subjects in consequence of his determination, he would retaliate. His next step was to prohibit the sale of the persons of men and to abolish personal slavery in his own dominions, giving encouragement to agriculture and manufacture. When I read this in academic environments, people are shocked and astounded to have the genealogies of liberty, the genealogies of freedom, the genealogies of anti-slavery struggles connected to African antecedents, rather than emerging, as it were, like Athena from the waves, fully formed from European post-Enlightenment rationalist thought. It's worth noting that amongst those enslaved Africans that had struggled against the institution of slavery before being sent into bondage and brought to these very shores, that there were ancestors of some of our most prominent abolitionist advocates in African American history. Among them, for example, to tie it directly to this story of this the African Muslim struggles, and by the way, there were anti-slavery struggles led by African Christians in the Congo. There were anti-slavery struggles led by practitioners of traditional African religions. They drew on the resources of their own cultures and their own communities to struggle against the fundamental injustice of their age, which is the call that obtains for us today as we try to struggle against the fundamental injustice of our age. The commoditization of human life and the reduction of human beings to bondage. So back to the genealogy. Among the prominent enslaved African Muslims, and by the way, this slave trade brought between 13 and 20 million Africans into bondage in the New World. It's estimated, I'm a specialist of Islam in West Africa, that 10 to 15% of those were Muslims, which also, by the way, is a useful narrative to grab onto in our communities when we are being told that, by Islamophobes, that Islam has nothing to do with American history. Africans bring Islam to these shores before there is a United States of America. It's a useful reminder, but they also bring genealogies of struggle for liberation. The maternal lineage of Frederick Douglass, America's greatest abolitionist, I think without question. On his maternal, it's well known that on his paternal side, he was fathered most likely by his own owner, who never liberated him. He liberated himself. But on his maternal side, his mother's last name was Bailey. Now, what's interesting is he came from those very same sea islands of South Carolina and Georgia, where the narrative that I led tonight's talk came from, and where many of the Muslims that were brought to the United States of America in the 1770s, 1780s, and 1790s were brought. Now, strikingly, there are no white Baileys in any of the census records on any of those sea islands, but there's lots and lots of Bilalis, which is a very common African name taken by West African Muslims. It is indeed the name that I chose for myself when I converted to Islam at the age of 15, Bilal. A formerly enslaved person who ends up becoming the second adult to convert to the religion of Islam and one of its principal intellectuals. The reason why I mention this is that a number of historians are of the opinion that Frederick Douglass' maternal lineage was likely Bilali and became anglicized as Bailey. That the greatest abolitionist in African American history was very likely descended from the very same anti-slavery struggles that I just outlined, which gives us a different kind of depth for our struggles. These struggles, especially for those of us that are Black and Black adjacent, is to understand that this is a struggle that African resources, intellectual, political, cultural, moral, and ethical, have been marshaled against for centuries, and that we need to root ourselves within the power of our own communities, within the power of our own histories, within the truth of our own struggles in order to stand up to the fundamental challenge of our time. And I'll end with one last word from the West African Islamic tradition that I think might be beneficial in today's gathering. In the Islamic understanding of the creation story, the first thing to understand is that the name Adam means black in ancient Arabic. And when the frame of Adam is molded and God breathes of his own breath into the human ancestor, our common ancestor, in order to animate it, there's a creature that's present that is commanded to bow to the frame of that shared human ancestor. That one is the one that we end up calling the devil. And when he's commanded to bow, he refuses and he says, I'm better than him. You made him from clay, and you made me from fire. West African Islamic scholars will often remind us that the devil is the first racist. And he has been trying to convince us to see one another with the same contempt that he has for all of us. We must therefore take this as a moral and ethical struggle and not just a political one. Because indeed, this effort to confine people because they are black, because they are brown, is a cosmic struggle. It is beyond just a sociological. And I'll end with that. Thanks.
Well, that was great. Thank you, Dr. Ware.